The shipping forecast on BBC Radio is as familiar as the sound of Big Ben chiming the hour. Yet, recognisable though the sea areas are by name, few people give much thought to where they are or what they contain. So Charlie Connelly sets off on a journey into the forecast to find out. Tom Goodman-Hill reads, "Attention all shipping."
North Utsira, South Utsira, southeasterly 3, increasing 4 or 5,
Fisher,
occasionally
German
6
bite.
later,
West or northwest 3 or 4, increasing 5 or 6.
Fastnet, Irish Sea,
Showers.
west backing
Good.
southwest 4 or 5, occasionally 6 later in North Irish Sea.
Sitting at home listening to the shipping forecast can be a cosily reassuring experience. There's no danger of a westerly gale 8, veering southwesterly, increasing severe gale 9 later, visibility poor, gusting through your average suburban living room, blowing the Sunday papers all over the place and traumatising the cat. Those of us who don't work on the sea see it as a kind of poetry, almost a comfort blanket that the world is still turning as it should. Those who do put out to sea, the people who actually know what the announcer is on about, see it as something different, a friendly, helpful, and above all, useful voice. With a great-grandfather who once sailed to the Falklands by mistake, a mother born on the Woolwich ferry, and a grandfather whose boating misadventures left him on first-name terms with every lifeboatman in the southeast, I began to rue that I had never had my timbers shivered, barnacles blistered, nor my deck pooped. Where were these curiously titled sea areas, and what do they contain? Who, what, or where was Utsira, of North and South fame? Who were Fisher, Bailey, and the most recent addition to the fold, Fitzroy? Who on earth can hear phrases like Low Latvia 1000 moving southeast and filling, and North Spain 1032 losing its identity, and know what they actually mean? But out there somewhere on the swell were fishermen, trawlermen, lifeboatmen, all tuning in, all of whom were depending on this strangely poetic mantra for their immediate safety. My task was set. I'd travel the shipping forecast. I'd know how and why it's there, where it came from, and what lies behind the mysterious names. What better way to continue the nautical legacy of my dock-watered bloodline? My first trip was to a small bleak island off the southwestern coast of Norway. If you're not used to boat trips, then this could be a traumatic experience, but most of the time the passengers get by, said one website with a shrug. The ferry trip is an adventure whether the weather's good or bad, was the cheerful message on another. When storms toss the water, it's fascinating to watch the waves. The only place to warrant more than one mention in the shipping forecast, Utsira is a tiny island populated by 240 hardy souls. Officially Norway's smallest community and just 4 square miles in size, this rocky outcrop in the North Sea is an unlikely candidate for broadcasting immortality, but Utsira is as fascinating as it is windy, and Utsira is very windy. Gingerly, I boarded the vessel, noting with some alarm the racks of sick bags in strategic places around the walls of the passenger lounge, and the proudly framed newspaper account detailing a local shipwreck and dramatic rescue from 1937. Only impressive self-control stopped me from looping my arm and head through a lifebelt and lashing myself to a pillar with ropes. As it turned out, the crossing was, by local standards, a gentle one. The odd downward lurch aside, no worse than driving over the brow of a hill, the gentle motion of the waves had a lulling effect that was more likely to send me to the land of Nod than the kingdom of Neptune. As we prepared to disembark, just over an hour later, a huge, bearded man in blue overalls appeared. "Are you English?" he ventured. This was Toralf, the man whose holiday cottage I would be renting. It turned out that Toralf was also the skipper of the ferry. "Are you a bird watcher?" was curiously his next question. There are more species of bird on the island than there are people, and the Utsira Bird Observatory is a thriving concern that brings in most of the community's visitors. The absence of binoculars, tripod, dandruff and beard probably made me quite a curiosity. Toralf said that his son Tor would meet me at the harbour and drive me to Sjølust, the cabin that would be my home for the weekend. And sure enough, as I disembarked, a huge cloud of dust followed a battered brown Toyota to the quayside at an impressive velocity. Tor had arrived. Square of jaw and late of teen, Tor unfurled his gangly arms and legs from the driver's seat and opened the boot of the car for my bag, through the rear window of which peered a football scarf reading Liverpool FC, Anfield. Tor set off along the main road, and before long we were at Sjølust in the southeast of the island. He showed me into the cabin and advised me that tonight was party night at the old schoolhouse. Utsira Football Club was having its annual knees-up, and I'd be very welcome. Oh, and I might want to bring along some drink if I was coming, as there was no bar. There aren't many places where you would pay £25 for a bowl of shrimps, the chance to see a comedian at whom you will laugh not once, and a covers band, and then leave feeling as though you've had a thoroughly good time, particularly if, as part of your 25 quid's worth of fun and frolics, you'd had to take your own booze. But then, there are probably not too many places in the world like Utsira. The wooden hall was filled with tables and chairs, dimly lit by candles. There were football shirts, shorts and socks pinned up around the walls. There was a stage at one end of the room, and a long table across the back, clearly intended for Tor and his friends. On each table was a basket of bread and a bowl of shrimp so large you could have dived headlong into it and comfortably won a game of Olympic standard hide-and-seek. I asked Tor, who it turns out plays in central midfield, if the island's football team is any good. "We used to be," he said. "The advantage we had was that the crossing to get here is so rough that all the teams would arrive very seasick. We would always beat them and won lots of trophies. Then the other teams complained to the league, and now we have to play all our matches on the mainland. These days we don't win anything." The band played for 4 hours, no less, and the room was filled with whirling figures, their rosy, shining faces caught in the candlelight, eyes flashing, and laughter rising above the music. Eventually the band finished, the candles guttered and died in their holders, and the lights came on. The floor was awash with spilled drinks and shrimp husks, and the air swam with laughter and farewells. I had to leave Utsira before dawn broke the next morning. I took my final walk across the island from North Utsira to South Utsira in darkness and silence. The moon was out, and I could see stars behind stars behind stars. The light from the lighthouse swept overhead, as a light has done here for more than 150 years, silently, efficiently, keeping watch over the sleeping islanders. My shipping forecast mission had got off to a lively start. Utsira had set the bar high in terms of quirkiness, not to mention contributing significantly to the average wind speed of my forthcoming journeys. The wind was calmer in Scotland, variable 3 or 4, according to that morning's forecast, but it was a dark night on the Black Isle. I'd just arrived on a bus driven at such speed that I blinked and almost missed the picturesque village of Cromarty, looming out of the gloaming of a wintry dusk. Given the velocity with which the bus had propelled a small group of shoppers and myself from Inverness, I half expected to be shot out of the doors as it took a sharp bend, straight through Cromarty and out to sea, skimming across the surface of the water like a pebble. Fortunately, the driver managed to throw out the anchors and halt only a few hundred yards beyond the stop. Cromarty's position on the headland at the very tip of the Black Isle means it's surrounded on 3 sides by water, hence no through traffic and no noise beyond my own footsteps and the distant sound of the waves breaking gently on an unseen shore. So far it was all very picture book. Rounding a corner to the waterfront, however, I was greeted by one of the most startling sights I think I've ever seen. Out in the Firth, barely 600 yards from where I was standing, was a full-scale oil platform lit up with dazzling orange and white lights, like an enormous floating birthday cake. A few hundred yards further on was another, identical construction. Having expected to have my breath taken away by rolling hills and snow-capped peaks, I'd been stopped dead in my tracks by an oil rig. There in the dark stillness as I watched this brilliant display of technology and light, it struck me that these hulking behemoths picked out against the hills beyond were probably among the most beautiful things I've ever seen. A faint thrumming emanated from them, barely audible above the apologetic lapping of the waves on the pebbly shore beneath me, the tiniest vibration that I could only just feel deep in my chest. I left the hotel the following morning and watched as the sun came up from behind me, warming the autumnal reds and yellows from the dark hills opposite that blended with the leafy rust colours of the platforms. Cromarty, I would discover as I walked around the village, has been in turns impressively rich and chronically poor. It's known good years and bad, prosperity and penury, yet every time this small town on a remote headland has come up against another existence-threatening economic challenge, it's bounced back stronger. Cromarty first came to prominence in medieval times when travellers progressed along the east coast on a series of ferries. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the town truly began to flourish as an important trading centre for fish and grain. And by the end of the 18th century, Cromarty had hit boom time, a successful businessman named George Ross investing a huge amount of money into the town, turning it into one of the great economic successes of the Scottish Highlands. He built a hand loom factory to work hemp brought to the town by ships from St. Petersburg, which would arrive with Russian snow still on the decks. A brewery, new harbour and courthouse were also constructed using Ross's money, not to mention the sumptuous Cromarty House, built on the site of the old Cromarty Castle. Before Ross built his pile, the most famous residents of the castle had been the Urquharts, several of whom were magnificently bonkers. One early Urquhart, for example, lived for several years convinced he was actually dead. Every night, his bed would be wheeled into the courtyard and winched up to battlement level by a series of pulleys so that it might be easier for his maker to come and spirit him away in the night. The best-known Urquhart, however, was Thomas, who lived in the mid-17th century. Thomas was the first man to translate Rabelais into English. He was also a total fruitcake. Although his Rabelais translations remain in high regard, his other writings were so eccentric as to be practically impenetrable. Making up words on the spot didn't help. Amblygonosphericals, extrinsical, gradifical, and obliquangular, for example, all appeared in the space of one paragraph in his book Tricetras, and none was ever heard of again. Sandy Woods, although he had lived an unremarkable life, epitomised for me the bloody-minded stubbornness that has maintained Cromarty through the centuries. Sandy had lived in Cromarty in the latter half of the 17th century, spending many years in a fearsome dispute with a neighbour over a boundary between their properties. The two men argued for decades, and so entrenched did the argument become that Sandy asked to be buried outside the cemetery close to the road. That way, he surmised, when the day of judgment came, he'd be able to get his side of the story in before his opponent. The light was failing as I walked east out of the town itself, in search of the now abandoned St. Regulus Cemetery on the far side of Cromarty House. The lights on the oil platforms in the Firth were picked out sharply as dusk fell. I found a 6x3 stone tablet almost perfectly camouflaged with moss and crisscrossed with coarse, long grass. Somewhere below my feet, deep in the cold Cromarty clay, lay the remains of a man biding his time until the day arrived when he could finally prove that he'd been right all along. It had been more than 300 years now, but his old bones were still poised for the moment when he could finally say, "I told you so."
Malin Hebrides, south or southeast, backing northeast 5 to 7. Showers,
Rockwell,
then rain.
southwest, veering west 4 or 5, increasing 6 or
Northwest
7.
Fitzroy, variable 3 or 4, mainly fair, good.